In this lecture, we're going to continue with our discussion of barriers to knowledge translation, and we begin here with understanding that the barrier represents a problem between researchers and policymakers or practitioners. And the photo on the left-hand side demonstrates a situation of measuring aerobic capacity. However, this is not a practical application for most users. And in a real-life athletic situation here, we see a coach arguing with referees during a game, and we can see right now the difficulty in trying to translate the information gained from a laboratory-based study to something that is usable and practical. And the problem with the barriers is that there tends to be a lack of understanding of the processes, the motivations, incentives, and inhibitory factors on both sides of this spectrum. And so, in terms of gaining a better understanding of these knowledge translation barriers, the first problem here is with the existing supply of evidence. And illustrated in these two pictures here, we see that there is a vast amount of research available to review. And each research piece possesses its own interpretation. And so if we think about a single research study, it takes time to read, understand, reflect upon, and put into practice just one research study, keeping in mind each study in and of itself has a limited scope. It is not uncommon for research studies to conflict with respect to the results with other similar studies in the same field. And that raises something called attention competition. And so the practitioner or the policymaker often struggles with which research study to rely on because these research studies do compete with one another for that attention. And so the problems related to this for practitioners and policymakers obviously are time constraints, because it does take time to read through a large body of research, as well as the applicability. The creativity in taking information generated from a research lab and putting it into practice does take time, and oftentimes the transfer to that policy or practical situation is often not very evident. So in terms of systematic reviews, can the systematic review help solve this problem? Potentially, because the systematic review collects the results from a large number of research studies, making it much more time efficient for the practitioner or the policymaker. However, research-based systematic reviews are often framed to a very specific question, and so this can be a barrier, because the specific systematic review, even though it may generally touch on a topic, let's say with cardiovascular disease, the review may be very specific to one and only one condition of cardiovascular disease. So the problem here obviously is the time for the research to reach the practitioner or the policy maker. And so this presents what's called a compressed time frame, and that's for the practitioner and the policy maker. So in a practical setting, decisions have to be made and actions have to be taken rather quickly. However, science moves at a very, very slow pace, and the researcher is often operating under a considerably expanded time frame to generate that research, whereas the practitioners and the policymakers have to work very quickly. And this poses a challenge. The challenge here is for researchers that often make rational decisions. And these rational decisions are objective based, they're also evidence based, but they're context free. And so each research study is conducted with a very specific question in mind, following through a number of steps. The practitioners and the policymakers, however, are driven to make not necessarily rational decisions, and when I mean by rational decision, a decision that follows a very specific protocol, but policymakers have to follow sensible decisions. And these are decisions that are pragmatic, that make sense, and these are decisions that operate within the context of the organization. And there is a very important institutional reality and a political reality that has to be given due credit. The second barrier here relates to the competition between influencing factors. And these factors involve the researcher. And when we think about the researcher is driven by a problem-solving approach. And to problem solve, the researcher uses a series of logical arguments, uses a degree of rationality. However, the practitioner or policymaker will often make decisions based upon personal and professional experience, whereas the generation of science and new information through research requires that a very specific set of objectives are carried out based on such logical arguments. And so the challenge here and the barrier in getting that information to becoming practical knowledge deals with understanding research mechanisms. And so oftentimes the research approach is not always accessible to the practitioner or the policy maker. However, convincing people to take a particular approach becomes very relatable if that advice comes from personal or professional experience, because personal and professional experience brings with it a degree of credibility. And people are much more receptive to a sense of credibility than trying to understand the intricacies of a research study, as this cartoon here illustrates, that passing on very valid, scientifically established information will often hit a barrier in that those that would use that information into knowledge may not be very receptive of that information. So this ends this video on two of the barriers for knowledge translation.